He is not named in any surviving scroll. No statue remembers his face. No poem mourns the fading of his beauty. And yet, for a time, he was everything to someone powerful. He lived in silence, wrapped in silk, his body scented and prepared not for war, but for pleasure. He was not free to speak, not free to love, and not free to age. There were no crowds to cheer him, only the quiet flicker of candlelight and the unspoken weight of command. This is not a story of romance. It is the quiet, invisible life of a male concubine in ancient Rome, obedient, vulnerable, and utterly forgotten. Ancient Rome was a civilization built on power, power over land, over law, over language, and, most quietly, over bodies. To live in Rome was to live within a strict hierarchy, and few understood the consequences of that structure more intimately than those who existed at its base: the enslaved, the silent, the owned. Among them were the concubines, male and female, kept not for labor or public service, but for private pleasure. The term concubinus in Latin referred to a boy or young man kept for sexual companionship, often within the household of a wealthy Roman male. He was not necessarily a prostitute, nor always a slave, though he frequently was both. The lines between affection, ownership, and utility blurred easily in Roman society, where status was everything and emotion was often considered weakness. A male concubine did not have legal recognition as a spouse, nor the dignity of being an equal. He was instead positioned somewhere between servant and ornament, part possession, part person, and entirely vulnerable. In the rigid social system of the Roman Empire, sexuality was not defined by gender so much as by dominance. The Roman ideal of masculinity placed emphasis on control over one's own desires, over politics, over others. A Roman citizen man could take pleasure from both women and men without shame, so long as he remained the dominant figure in the act. It was not the gender of the concubine that invited social judgment. It was his submissive role. For a freeborn Roman male to be penetrated, to be used as a concubine, was viewed as deeply shameful. But for an enslaved boy, stripped of rights and voice, that shame was considered irrelevant. He was not expected to feel dignity. Only obedience. The male concubine often entered this life not by choice, but by selection. He might be purchased in a market, gifted to a powerful man, or taken from a conquered people. Youth and beauty were currency. The smoother the skin, the softer the voice, the more delicate the features, the higher his value. Many were castrated to preserve their boyish appearance. Others were simply discarded once the illusion of youth faded. He did not speak unless spoken to. His role was to please, to listen, to never resist. He was trained not in academics or warfare, but in grace, in silence, in submission. Inside the villa, he would live among opulence he could never claim as his own. Marble floors, perfumed halls, silver bowls filled with fruit, his world was filled with softness, but offered no comfort. He might share a room near his master's chamber, always close enough to summon, but never far enough to escape. He would be bathed daily, his skin oiled, his hair combed. He wore fine garments, not for his own pleasure, but to enhance his beauty for the gaze of others. Every part of him was crafted, his body a canvas, his behavior a performance. There were no rights to protect him. Roman law offered little recourse for enslaved people, and even less for those kept in sexual service. If he resisted, he could be beaten. If he displeased, he could be sold. His pain was not documented. Silence was his only shield. And yet, within that silence, there was survival. Some concubines learned to read their master's moods, to navigate the shifting tides of favor and frustration. They learned when to smile, when to retreat, when to flatter. Some even became trusted favorites, granted gifts, spoken to with a tenderness rarely offered in Roman households. But it was a fragile power, one that could vanish overnight. What set the male concubine apart from other slaves was not simply his purpose, but his visibility. He was kept close, displayed yet never acknowledged in public. In a society obsessed with appearances, It was both a secret and a symbol, a hidden luxury that spoke volumes about a master's wealth and appetite. His presence revealed what Roman values often concealed: that beneath the marble and empire there was cruelty wrapped in civility, possession masked as affection. This was the world he belonged to, not by invitation, but by force. A world where his name was forgotten, but his body remembered. A world where intimacy was redefined as obedience, and love was never allowed to grow. His day began before the masters, in the pale stillness before dawn. Long before the villa stirred with servants and footsteps, he would rise. The stone floor beneath his bare feet was cold, even in summer, and the air hung with the scent of oil, citrus, and morning dew. A servant might come to him, or he might prepare himself alone. His body was to be clean, always. Not for health, but for touch. He would wash in warm water scented with herbs, lavender, myrtle, or crushed rose petals. Any blemish, any sign of aging, was noted. Ointments were rubbed into his arms, his chest, his thighs. His hair, grown long at the back and carefully shaped at the front, was combed until it shone. If his master preferred a certain style, he obeyed without question. His clothing was selected not for comfort, but for appearance. A thin tunic, perhaps dyed soft blue or ivory, tied loosely to fall just so across the shoulder. Silk, if the household could afford it. Always something soft. Always something easily removed. He was trained not to speak unless addressed. Not because he was ignorant, many concubines were taught to read, to play instruments, even to recite poetry. These were not gifts, but enhancements. A concubine who could entertain was more valuable. But his role was not to impress with brilliance, only to please with polish. He was never to contradict, never to show anger, never to weep, at least not where he could be seen. Meals came at odd times. He might be summoned to sit silently while the master dined, to taste the food first in case it was poisoned, or to feed the master pieces of fruit by hand. His own appetite was irrelevant. If he was allowed to eat, he did. If not, he waited. He was not there to be nourished, only to be present. In the afternoons, he might be displayed like a painting reclining in the courtyard, or seated quietly in a corner where guests could see him without needing an introduction. He was part of the scenery, yet impossible to ignore. The master's friends would glance, some with curiosity, some with jealousy, some with quiet disgust. But no one said anything. Everyone in Roman society knew what such arrangements meant, and no one dared to question a man's dominion over his own house or his own property. Sometimes he was gifted jewelry, a gold ring, a strand of pearls, an ivory comb. Sometimes, nothing. Sometimes he was praised for his beauty, other times ignored entirely. He learned not to depend on affection. Affection was fleeting. Beauty was currency, and youth had an expiration date. He knew this. When summoned to the master's chamber, he entered quietly. There was no place for ceremony or affection-only performance. His touch was not his own. His breath was not his own. He gave what was expected. If he was gentle, it was because gentleness was asked for. If he was silent, it was because silence had become his only safety. Not all days were cruel. There were moments of kindness, even warmth. A hand on the shoulder, a word spoken gently. A song played softly while the sun set through the columns of the atrium. But he never allowed himself to believe these moments were real. They were pauses in the inevitable. The concubine's world was narrow. He was not permitted to leave the villa without escort. He did not own anything, not even the clothes he wore. If he fell ill, he was treated quickly, less out of care, more out of fear that he might lose the very attributes that made him useful. If he cried out in pain, he was reminded of others who would take his place if he could not continue. There was always another boy. There was always another beauty waiting in the market. He might overhear conversations between senators, generals, or philosophers while they reclined on couches and sipped spiced wine. He might listen to great men debate the fate of provinces, while his own future hung unspoken in the shadows. He was surrounded by power, but possessed none. He lived at the center of Rome's most refined luxury, but stood at the farthest edge of autonomy. At night, he returned to his small chamber if he was not required elsewhere. There, in the flickering silence of an oil lamp, he would unbind his hair, wipe the color from his lips, and remove the soft things that had adorned him. The mirror did not lie. Each day he aged, even if only slightly. A line deepened, a shadow lingered under his eye, a flush of color faded from his cheeks, and he knew. He knew the day would come when someone younger, smoother, more radiant would arrive and he would be asked to step aside. He did not know what would happen after. Few did. Some were sold, some were dismissed with nothing. A rare few were allowed to serve in the household in lesser roles, assistant to the steward, wine-bearer, messenger. Some disappeared. Rome did not write their endings. Rome rarely acknowledged their beginnings. And yet, for a time, he had been adorned. He had walked quietly across mosaic floors, slept under painted ceilings, tasted the rarest fruits, and been whispered to by men who ruled armies. For a time, he had mattered if only as a shadow of someone else's desire. There is no record of what happened to him. No farewell etched into stone. No letter passed down through generations. When he was no longer needed, he simply vanished. Perhaps he was sold to another villa, where his duties continued in silence. Perhaps he was cast into the streets of Rome. His fine robes replaced by rags, his body bruised by time. Perhaps he died of fever, or loneliness, or the quiet collapse of a life that had never truly belonged to him. Ancient Rome did not record the lives of men like him. It celebrated emperors, generals, philosophers, and the women who bore their heirs. But the concubine. He existed in the margins, desired, used, then forgotten. And yet, his presence lingers in the spaces between marble columns and soft torchlight, in the echoes of quiet footsteps across a mosaic floor, in the faded colors of frescoes that once adorned the private chambers of the elite. He was not powerless in his soul, though the law said otherwise. He knew how to read glances, to avoid moods, to hold still. He understood survival as a language, learned each day through observation and silence. That, too, was a form of intelligence. Though no one praised him for it, he bore pain without protest, longed without hope, and gave without expectation. To some, he was nothing but a thing. To others, a memory. To history, a shadow. But in truth, he was something else entirely. He was a human being, living, feeling, fearing, dreaming if only briefly, and always in secret. His story is not a legend. It has no climax, no war, no triumph, but it holds something rarer. Truth, the truth of what it meant to be owned, not just in body, but in every moment of waking life. The truth of beauty turned into bondage, of intimacy stolen and sold. When we walk through ancient ruins, we often imagine the grandeur, the senators, the speeches, the battles. But rarely do we stop to think of the quiet ones, the ones who stood behind the marble doors, waiting to be called, touched, dismissed. This too was Rome. This too was empire. So let us remember him, not by name, but by presence. Let us remember the silence he was forced to carry, and the dignity he was never allowed to claim, because somewhere beneath the dust of centuries, his story still breathes, and now so do we, as witnesses